As she slowly opened her eyes, she couldn't tell what time it was. Of course, she was used to that. She had lived on ships and stations for so long now that she had almost forgotten what it was like to tell the time of day just by the light of a star. Her world was always lit, ever illuminated by the fluorescent lights raining down from metal ceilings. Still, this ceiling was still quite familiar to her as she stared up at it. She had been knocked out when she was first brought here, and ever since then she had spent quite a bit of time rather delirious. Although she had been lucid for long enough to know where she was and what was happening to her. Her six-parted ears twitched slightly as she tried to get a handle on her surroundings, doing their best to capture as much sound as they could in a wave-like motion that funneled the vibrations of air right into her ear channel. Though admittedly, most of what she heard was still covered by a high-pitched ringing that had yet to leave her ears ever since that big explosion. She tried to push herself up. However, she flinched for a moment, as a biting pain from her ankle stopped her in her tracks for a few seconds, forcing her to clench her teeth and take a deep breath before she continued to move. The area just over her right eye was also pounding heavily, and she felt a rather lopsided weight pull on the muscles of her neck. Maybe she should have them break the other antler off as well, because it certainly couldn't be good for her the way that it was. She glanced down at her leg that was wrapped in a thick cast and hung up in a bit of a sling as she pushed herself up even further. It still hurt like hell, but at least she didn't feel internal parts grinding against each other anymore. Hopefully this would help it heal a bit better, like they had said. Eventually, she strained her neck against the uneven weight on her head to turn it as she glanced around the room, trying to concentrate more on the source of the muffled noises that were mostly overpowered by the ringing in her ears. The first thing she saw was the white back of the doctor, standing in front of one of the two other beds in this room she had been brought into. She didn't quite understand why he was wearing white. It was one of the rare situations where she fully understood why he would cover himself at all, since she could relate to not wanting to get whatever muck came out of his patients directly onto his skin. But still, she felt like wearing white would just show how dirty it got in such a case way too quickly. Still, it wasn't really her business to care. The doctor seemed to be in the middle of quietly speaking to the patient laying in that other bed. When she looked down at the man in the bed, she could see his constant muscle twitches and agonized expression, as he did his very best to lie still and focus on what his doctor was telling him. And we'll increase the dosage of the anti-inflammatory for a while, which will hopefully reduce the swelling around those nerves and allow you to relax a bit. We managed to acquire a large doses from your species providers. Additionally, we can try to start you on some electric stimulation therapy to possibly help you regain more consistent control over your movements. The man in white calmly explained in a discreet manner. You will be wearing an external device that will connect to your body with electrodes, which will stimulate your muscles in ways that level out the erratic signals they get from your nerves. The man in the bed lifted his head slightly in a jittery movement, and the feline ears on his head stood up. Do you really think my body needs any more juice? He asked the doctor with a smirk, and clear humor on his face. However, the quivering way in which he spoke made it sound like he was under quite a lot of strain. The doctor nodded slowly. Given your circumstances, it is likely our best option to retain your quality of life, he informed his patient professionally. But then he paused for a long moment, and awkwardly cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with what he was going to say next, as he spoke up again. Well, although this goes against my personal morals, as a man of medicine, my oath dictates that I also ask you if you have put any thought into the other options that we have previously discussed. The man in the bed laughed and shook his head shakily. Those aren't options, he stated confidently. Do the electric thing. The doctor nodded and smiled down at the man, seeming rather pleased with that answer. "Very well, I'll put it into motion," he said, and quickly made a note on a small device he held in his hand. "Try to rest for now." Then he turned his head and looked straight at her, seeming to have noticed that she had stirred and listened to the conversation. "Miss Skye." The doctor greeted her and started to slowly walk over to her bed. "How are we feeling after our nap?" Skye sat a bit straighter as the small primate approached her, though the sling holding her leg up prevented her from sitting entirely straight. "Air's still killing me," she said as a direct reply. "Also, I think the asymmetry is really getting to my neck." She reached a hand up and briefly rubbed along the muscles of her neck, enjoying the slightly comforting feeling of her own massaging fingers. "At this point, we might just have to take it off," she added, still feeling a bit groggy, and reached her other hand to the base of her non-broken antler to pull on it for a moment. The doctor nodded slowly. "We should have more pain medication to help you with your headaches soon. Luckily you cats here aren't all too picky," he said, as he looked down at his device for a moment. "And yes, if you feel that the uneven antlers are putting too much strain on your neck, it might be prudent to level them out. This will also help them regrow more evenly. I will schedule you for an appointment if you want." Skye just nodded. It was a bit of a shame. She really liked her antlers. But with one of them already broken away in big parts, keeping the other around like this would just be a case of really dumb pride. "Let me know what you want for it later," she mumbled under her breath. As the doctor made a note of her wishes with a sigh and a slight shake of his head, he briefly glanced at the side of her bed. "Speaking of which, you haven't touched your food again," he noted, with a slightly worried and more so disappointed tone that bordered on mild annoyance. Skye followed his gaze to her bedside, where a small side table stood. Usually it was filled with small bits and bobs, like her personal assistant and some stuff from her pouches, and didn't serve much else of a purpose. But right now, a large bowl of a really nice-looking salad stood on top of it as well. Well, at least Skye remembered it looking really nice when it was first brought to her, with nice, luscious green leaves and deeply red and yellow vegetables all cut together into a beautiful presentation. By now, the leaves had started to wilt slightly, and their luscious, vibrant green colour had dipped more into a bit of a sickly hue that indicated they were a bit past their best now. Still, despite its not quite so appealing anymore appearance, Skye couldn't quite prevent her stomach from grumbling as she looked down at the sumptuous meal. She had quite successfully ignored it so far, mostly by distracting herself with her own pain and the voices of her company. But now that she was looking directly at food, she couldn't help but fully feel how hungry she was. Quickly, she pulled her eyes away from it to once again focus her mind on a different topic. "I don't need your arms," she grumbled slightly at the doctor, not at all enjoying that he had reminded her of how long it had been since she had really eaten anything. The doctor just sighed again. "You have to eat in order to heal," he told her, in a tone that tried so very hard to be respectful, and felt so miserable at not sounding belittling. "I'll eat when I can work for it," Skye mumbled in return. "Just give me something to do." The doctor paused a moment and rubbed his eyes with 2 fingers. "I'm not going to put my patients to work," he told her in a very deliberate tone. "Then tell the captain to give me something," Skye insisted for a moment, trying her very best to sound convincing. It wasn't like she didn't want to eat. She was really hungry. Just anything. "You're recovering. Nobody demands that you work for your food while you are. Besides, you are in no condition to—" The doctor wanted to insist again. However, he was cut off by a shaky voice from across the room. "Entertain me," it said. And both Skye's and the doctor's gaze quickly shot to the man still quietly twitching in his bed. Skye looked at him confused for a moment, but not as much as the doctor, who asked, "What?" in mild irritation, Seemingly both had been interrupted, and at what the man was saying. The man in the bed chuckled weakly for a moment. I can't really sleep like this right now, he then said, and lifted his shaking head to look directly at Sky, making it clear he was speaking to her and not the doctor. I'm gonna be bored out of my mind. If I just have to lie here like this, so entertain me a bit and I'll pay for your food. He released a wheezing laugh and smiled at Sky for a moment, before another muscle twitch caused him to reveal his long, predatory fangs from behind his lips. Sky looked at the man for a long moment, her eyes becoming a bit bigger as she took in his happy face. That was very clearly still in pain. Right, she then said, and quickly pulled her gaze away from him, crossing her arms. I guess I can do that. The man chuckled loudly again, before shifting his gaze slightly to look at the doctor. Could you have some more food brought of her, please? He asked the man, with a happy and empathetic expression. The doctor had a slightly disgruntled look on his face, and Sky had a suspicion that he was really not happy with his other patient enabling her behavior. Still, it seemed like he wasn't going to argue with getting his unwilling patient eating again. Sure, of course, he said, and started to turn to leave the room. He ran a hand through his hair as he moved, disheveling it slightly, and he shook his head, clearly unamused. He also mumbled something under his breath in a language that Sky didn't understand, but whatever it was didn't exactly sound nice. Only once he was out, and the door had closed behind him, did Sky turn to her current roommate. Thanks, she mumbled for a moment. It felt really odd and also kind of bad to thank someone for giving her a task and putting her to work, so to speak. However, at that moment, a deep and honest feeling of thankfulness overrode all those emotions. No problem, the man in the bed replied, and slowly placed his head back down onto the pillow, so he wouldn't have to hold it up anymore to look at her, though she noticed that his ears still attentively perked up. It was about time that we got to talk a bit. Sky nodded slowly. Right, she said. Then she wondered for a moment how exactly she would go about entertaining her roommate here. The first step would possibly be to get a better grasp of what kind of person she was dealing with here. After all, she was still surrounded by all kinds of colourful nutcases. Your name's Miraksha, right? She did her very best to pronounce the name she had heard dropped by the doctor and visitors a couple of times properly, despite its sounds feeling very awkward for her tongue and lips to make. It was a good thing she had gotten some training in when it came to speaking more properly, even if she couldn't even think about that without putting a sarcastic undertone onto the word in her mind. Yup, and you're Sky. Miraksha chuckled at the odd introduction, while he stared up at the ceiling, only paying attention to her with his ears. Sorry you got so banged up in that explosion. After hearing that, Sky quickly asked the first question that came to her mind. I's alright. So what happened to you? She blurted out. You look right messed up. Miraksha laughed his wheezing laugh again, seeming very amused by her words. My, aren't you direct? He said, his shaking voice filled with sincere amusement. Quite refreshing. He then exhaled with a long, almost satisfied-sounding sigh, as he seemingly got ready to answer her question. Well, I had a run-in with the guy these people here call a saint. He then told her, once he wasn't constantly laughing anymore, although the amusement still remained and lit up his voice. Didn't seem very saintly to me, though, I must admit. He laughed some more, which then briefly turned into a mild cough for a couple of seconds, before he caught himself again. Like you so fittingly said, he then added, once the coughing fit was over, He messed me up good. Sky glanced up in mild surprise. She had heard the term saint being thrown around a couple of times around here. Of course, however, for her, it was hard to believe that the person connected to it was responsible for this. At least, it was at first. But then she thought for a moment and figured, was it really? After all, the feline wasn't the first heavily injured person she had met who had their life altered by an encounter with the first human she ever met. James did that, huh? She asked the man, and looked at his softly shaking body again, wondering how she ought to feel about that. Yeah, Miraksha replied. Didn't like it at all when I touched his little kitty. Sky nodded slowly, the picture of Shida popping into her mind, especially of the first time the two had met. Yeah, he likes her a lot, she confirmed. Had a gun to my face once when I was with her. She then chuckled a bit nervously. Luckily, he didn't pull the trigger. For a moment, she wondered if she had actually been in danger back then, given everything she knew now. Of course, back then, she had definitely been scared for her life for a moment. However, ever since, she had felt like the situation had, overall, actually been pretty safe. Had she maybe taken in too lightly? Then again, she remembered the last time she had met James and Shida, back at that weird bar. There he had seemed pretty level-headed, all things considered. On the other hand, Raprig had lost his leg that very same day James had pointed his weapon at her as well. Still, she couldn't help but mumble, but he's a pretty nice guy otherwise. She didn't exactly expect a good reaction from someone who had been given this much damage by the human to a statement like that. However, to her surprise, Miraksha released a single hoarse laugh in response. So I've heard, he said, seriously sounding like he believed there was something to his attacker, not being all that bad in usual circumstances. Too bad I got on his bad side. There was a certain carelessness to the man that Sky couldn't quite understand, considering his situation. She honestly didn't know she could stay so calm if she was tied to a bed like he was. She was pretty peeved about the cast around her leg, and the ringing in her ears alone. However, she also didn't really know how to continue from there, so she had to think for a moment what other topics she could possibly bring up to entertain the man. So, what were those other options the doc was talking to you about? Sounded quite serious. She then wondered after a moment, feeling like she had probably either slept through them speaking about it at some point, or that the topic had possibly been discussed before she had joined the feline in this room. Miraksha released a long breath through his nose, and lifted his arm for a moment, obviously looking at it as it shook and twitched. He took it in wordlessly for a good while, before he inhaled again to reply. You know, human stuff, he said, with a tone that sounded somewhere between resigned and even slightly disturbed. They could go into my body and artificially fix it up, but pump some small mutants into me that could repair my nerves. He shuddered slightly. Although he kept his explanation on a vague and humorous side, it seemed the thought of what would actually happen during those procedures alone was enough to make chills run down his spine. No, thanks, he then added determinedly, and briefly shook out his head with a shudder that didn't seem to be caused by his usual twitching. I'm good. Sky gave him a bit of a courtesy chuckle in return, though her mind stuck to that for a bit. It seemed like the guy was pretty screwed overall, if treated with conventional methods. And usually she'd also have been like, well, nothing to do about that, better learn to live with it. However, she had to admit, having a seemingly easy solution so openly presented to you, and not taking it, even if the idea of that cure disgusted her as much as it did him in principle, she didn't know if she'd have the strength to do it. She remembered Raprig and his crutch. He had seemed happy enough with it. Then again, She didn't think that anyone had ever walked up to him and offered to replace that leg, given who he was treated by. Though she was sure he would have declined that offer in a heartbeat. On the other hand, James also seemed happy enough with his new arm, so it seemed that both options didn't really inherently make you sadder. And also, although losing a limb surely sucked more than she could imagine, what Maraksha was going through there almost seemed worse to her, in a way. It really didn't seem like he could do all too much on his own anymore, far more so than if he was just a bit restricted in how he could move or handle things. It was a hard question, and she didn't know if she should respect or question the man for dismissing his options of getting rid of his problems so outright. But in the end, he seemed happy enough with it, and, well, he had respected her outwardly dumb decisions. "Right," she therefore said with pretended cheerfulness. "Don't need none of that." With Maraksha getting her eating again, Sky's healing process seemed to speed up exponentially. Her headache subsided very soon after she had her asymmetrical antlers removed and brought to one level by the doctor, and she could soon pull her leg out of the sling, even if it still had to remain in its cast for a bit. Even the ringing in her ears had long started to subside, and was barely noticeable now. It seemed that luck had been on her side in a way, and apart from cracking her ankle, the explosion had done no real lasting damage. Her antlers would grow back in time. Her hearing was fine again. Maybe she'd walk a bit funny for a while, but that was fine. After all, it had gotten her out of that cell. She still could hardly believe what she had been pulled into by association there. Realized sapience and orbital strikes. This was all way above her pay grade. And ever since they had left that prison, she couldn't quite help the feeling that there was a lot she wasn't told about what had happened. So far, out of the people she had gone to that station with, she had only seen the captain ever since they had been busted out. She wondered where the others may have been sometimes. But whatever may have been the case, the time soon came when she would be allowed to walk around again, even if she'd still need a little assistance with walking at all. Miraksha, on the other hand, wasn't doing nearly as hot with his recovery. Sky tried to talk to him as much as she could, but the man was quite exhausted most of the time, and rarely in any real condition to talk. It seemed like his constant muscle spasms took a lot out of him, and the fact that he got barely any movement otherwise didn't help with that either. The same was pretty much true for the third person they shared a room with. He was another Miat called Amana. However, unlike Miraksha, he didn't speak Galactic Uniform very much, meaning Sky couldn't really talk to him for the most part. Though the few times when Miraksha or one of his friends translated for her, he seemed like a pretty nice guy, all things considered. Not quite as calm and joyous as Miraksha, but nice enough. Overall, those two had a lot of visitors. A bunch of people that seemed to have served together with them in the military. Sky always enjoyed it when they came around, because Miraksha's and Amana's eyes always lit up when they spoke to their friends and colleagues. Although sometimes that joy was a bit hampered whenever their colleagues got really angry at something. Sky didn't really understand what they were ranting and fighting over in their native language whenever it happened, but one time she had asked Miraksha about it when he exhaustedly sighed after one of his friends had left in a huff after it had once again come to tensions between them for a moment. "He just feels very helpless and desperately wants to do something, just anything," Miraksha had explained vaguely, clearly avoiding it to answer the question fully. "But the thing he has somehow set his mind to is stupid and needless." Miraksha left it at that, leaving Sky to wonder what exactly his friend had set his mind to. She couldn't imagine what was so important that it was worth starting a fight with your friend, who was that sick over. But Miraksha still seemed to enjoy the visits of his friend, even if they fought occasionally. Whenever they didn't, they seemed like they were really close. And at least it seemed like that electrotherapy thingy-majig did some good for him. Whenever it was connected to him and activated, his spasms stopped for the most part, and he got some control over his body back. It seemed amazing to Sky that, although electricity did this to him in the first place, it also seemed to heal his symptoms. Still, it was only a temporary reprieve. According to the doctor, leaving that device running constantly would be even more detrimental to the Miet's health, and so he had to use it sparingly, only whenever he really needed to move precisely, for example, when he ate. Apart from that, he would still have to spend most of his time in a bed or wheelchair. But at least he could move now, if he really wanted to. Meanwhile, Sky's walking capabilities got back to a point where she could leave her room and wander the ship they were on for a bit. At least, wherever she was allowed to go. There were a concerning number of rooms on the comparatively small vessel, which she was permanently denied access to. Not that she had ever expected to get a lot of trust, since she had started being around this sort of crowd, but the degree to which she was kept out of things right now was still concerning. That was until one day, a somewhat unexpected guest showed up in her room. Captain Uton slowly came lumbering in through the open door. His movements seemed to have a certain weight to them, that far exceeded what he usually brought onto the scale. It almost seemed like he was dragging around some ballast with each motion. Still, as he moved up to her bed on all fours and looked at her with his dark face, there was a tired, clearly forced smile on his face. However, Sky's eyes were much more drawn to the much smaller, blonde human accompanying him. She couldn't quite tell why, but she didn't like that one's aura one bit, as he looked at her with an impartial expression. "Hello, Sky," Uton greeted her with his deep voice, while his hanger-on kept staring quietly with his cold blue eyes. "I hear that you are recovering well." "For the most part," Sky replied with a nod, and did her best to rip her gaze away from the unsettling human, although she focused her no longer ringing ears on him directly, to make sure she'd always know what he was doing. "Leg's still giving some trouble. Otherwise, I can't complain." Uton nodded for a moment, and glanced at her cast with a look that was filled with consternation. His gaze also wandered up to her trimmed antlers. "Well, it will heal in time," he then mumbled after a long while of staring, and it seriously sounded like he wanted to reassure himself, more than he was trying to console her. "Right," Sky said with a nod. "So, what you want from me?" She still needed to pay a lot back when it came to her treatment here, so she was quite eager to get back to work, and she hoped that Uton was here because he had a task for her. Maybe that would also help her get an idea about what was going on this ship, or where they were even going. Seeming to sense her eagerness, Uton nodded. "I have a very important task for you," the captain then explained, and slowly turned to his smaller companion. "Alexander, would you maybe care to explain it yourself?" The way Uton looked at the man, something wasn't right about it. He didn't look afraid, but he sort of did. But not really. It was odd. Alexander seemed to have little enthusiasm about talking to Sky. He didn't directly show any displeasure or disapproval of doing so. However, there was not a hint of him having any sort of emotional movement from addressing her with her task, as he briefly wiped some of his blonde hair away from his forehead. "I'm going to need you as a sort of personal assistant of mine for a while," he said to Sky, and as he talked, he gave Uton a seriously cutting side-eye for a second. "We're going to reach our destination soon, and when we do, you will stay close to me in case I need you, and you will not go anywhere without letting me know about it first. I need you to be constantly available and reachable for me in case I need to bestow any tasks upon you, either in person or through one of my people. Do that, and you will be handsomely rewarded. Do we understand each other?" Sky could tell by his voice that he left the "and if you don't" part out of his offering deliberately. She wasn't quite sure she even wanted to know in the end, especially not with the way the captain was looking at the man at that moment. "Aye," Sky replied, after a moment of hesitation. She hadn't hesitated because she had thought about declining at any point, but accepting just really didn't feel right to her either. "Very well," Alexander said with a nod. Then, he gave Uton another long, rather cutting look that Sky really didn't know how to interpret before he unceremoniously turned and left the room again. As he walked, he added, "One of my people will get to you tomorrow. Do what he tells you." Sky nodded to herself for a moment as she watched him leave. Once he was out of the room, she commented, "Peachy fellow?" Uton sighed. "He's the one who got us out of detention," he then explained in a low voice, almost as if he wanted to make sure the human didn't hear him, although he had already left. Sky tilted her head slightly, her ears twitching in a wave-like motion for a moment. "Thought that was Esfatara and his Mia pals," she wondered, as she had picked up on those felines definitely having played a part in that explosion that messed her up. Uton cleared his throat. "They were involved as well," he confirmed for her, "but Alexander was the driving force." Sky nodded once again, carefully. "So, what does he want from me?" she wondered, looking at the door for a moment, as if she expected to see an after-image of the blonde human. She could hear Uton swallowing heavily, even as he tried to hide it from her. Little escaped her fine ears. "Nothing bad," he assured her, quite clearly suppressing a nervous tinge to his voice. "He just needs an errand girl." Sky found it hard to believe that, especially since Alexander had mentioned his people multiple times already. It sounded to her like he had more than enough errand boys and girls. Still, for once, she wasn't quite sure if asking too many questions would be in her best interest here. And even if it was unlikely she'd get anything out of Uton. It wasn't like he shared all too much with her. Afterwards, she spent a brief moment just catching up with the captain a bit, talking about her recovery and what he had been doing since they got busted out. But obviously, he still wasn't telling her everything on that front. Eventually, the old primate stood up and said his goodbyes, leaving the room again while still moving like he was dragging some weight with him. It almost seemed like he had also gotten injured in the explosion, though Sky felt like that likely wasn't the reason. Once he was out, Sky suddenly saw someone sit up on the other side of the room. Miraksha had activated his electric stimulation device and was sitting up relatively smoothly as he looked over at her with a serious expression. Sky was expecting him to do something else for a moment, but he just sat there. It seemed he had turned the device on, just to look at her. "Be careful with that one," he then said, his voice a lot smoother now that his nerves were soothed by the electric current. "Alexander, I mean. Be careful while you're around him." Sky tilted her head. "You know him?" she asked curiously, wondering where that warning came from. Miraksha nodded. "He's the one paying for my recovery here," he said, and nodded to the device connected to him. "He also helped us escape Dunama when things got bad for us. I owe him a lot." Sky was slightly confused. For a moment, she reached a hand to one of her antlers to pull on it, through muscle memory, only to realize it wasn't there anymore. "Why should I be careful of him, then?" she asked curiously, letting her hand sink down again, and pulling slightly on the fur on her neck instead. Miraksha's ears flicked slightly, as he seemed to think about how to reply to that for a moment, his tail gradually swaying over the mattress of his bed. "Well, much like with our common friend, the Saint," he then finally began to explain, and looked down at the electrodes that were connected to his body. It is better to stay on his good side. Meanwhile, Captain Uton reached the bridge of their ship. Alexander had already been there for a while, and was in the middle of an important conversation, as the large primate slowly skulked in. Much of his pretended energy from earlier had left him, and his shoulders hung deep as he crawled into the room on all fours. Alexander mildly rolled his eyes with a sigh, and very briefly reached for the sharp corners of the pendant around his neck. "Have you wasted enough time yet?" he then asked the captain without looking at him, and his blue eyes narrowed down as he spoke. "If you are done worrying about your little pet project, maybe we can discuss some actually important things now." Uton made a huffing sound and gave Alexander a dark glare as he approached him. However, before he truly retorted anything to the human's words, another voice interrupted him. "Theramore!" A high-pitched voice came from the screen that Alexander had been looking at, and it annoyed him slightly that she sounded honestly excited to see the old primate. "You look tired. How are you feeling?" On the screen, none other than Apogianora Adoxiatuya, the leader supreme of the GCS and High Matriarch of the Zoditos herself, looked at the captain with compassionate eyes. It probably shouldn't have been surprising, considering how long those two knew and had worked with each other. Still, Alexander admittedly found this kind of softball treatment kind of out of place. Uton looked back at the High Matriarch with a look on his face that very clearly told of him truly not knowing how to feel about her at the moment. "According to the circumstances," he then finally replied in a low hush, barely able to make eye contact with her. Tuya nodded and lifted her split trunk, as if to console the man through the screen. "It is regrettable, the way things have developed. However, for now they are unfolding splendidly," she explained, doing her best to sound cheerful about their successes. Alexander wasn't quite sure how appropriate that was. After all, many of the captain's friends, or at the very least acquaintances, were dead now. So while he personally also greatly enjoyed their successes, he wasn't sure if he would try to celebrate them with the captain any time soon. The man deserved his chance to grieve, to mourn the cost of success. Still, before this could derail any further, Alexander found himself using the insensitive comment as a transition to a more sensible topic. "Indeed, it seems like for the time being we've successfully shaken the people's trust in Saint Aldwyn, and those who stand with him," he announced in a firm voice. "However, if we simply leave things as they are, this won't last forever. The time to act is now." "Quite. Both Earth and Dunamur seem to be in an uproar after their forces were apparently involved in such a heinous attack. Their trust in their current governments was already rather shaky. It seems they will have quite a bit of work in front of them to keep up their control," the High Matriarch confirmed for him. Alexander nodded. However, his gaze hardened, and his hand closed around his pendant. "Still, I'm sure I don't have to remind you about the foe we face," he said determinedly. "Even if it was on its own, the affront we face would be a formidable opponent. Who knows what systems it has already wormed its way into? And only now that its protectors are in disarray do we have any chance of facing it and ending with its eradication. We cannot let this window of opportunity slip us by." Uton looked at him glumly. "The eyes of the entire cosmos are on that realized right now. There is no way you will get to it without it being noticed," he remarked, and drummed his thick fingers on the ground for a moment. Alexander scoffed. "The cosmos will not shed a single tear for that creature," he replied confidently, and squeezed his hand so that the corners of the star-framed cross pierced into his flesh from the pressure. "If we come for it, and his patron saint doesn't stand in our way, then no one else will either." Uton released a dissatisfied sound. His fur stood up slightly as he did. "You're not in front of a camera," he said, annoyed in a deep bark. "Do you have to harp on about that saint thing?" Alexander looked back at him unshaken. "I was the one who proclaimed him a saint. I cannot deny his title," he replied, seemingly to the further annoyance of the larger primate. However, their exchange was interrupted by the High Matriarch. "And since you are so aware of the time-sensitive nature of our task, I am sure you already have ideas you wish to share with us when it comes to how to proceed. I have my own, of course, but I would like to hear what you have in mind," she said in a sharp tone that was very clearly supposed to tell the primates to stop bickering with each other. Alexander turned back to her and composed himself. "Of course," he said. "In fact, I might need a small bit of help from your side. Do you still have contact to your agents in the SATAC system?" Tua turned her head slightly as Alexander brought them up. "Only minuscule," she replied. "We can't truly contact them for important things because surely anything that reaches them will be intercepted by the Realized. They are right in its territory, after all." Alexander nodded, but looked at her with his posture slowly opening up. "Contact them anyway," he asked of her. "We're going to need them for what happens next."